I was 10 when my grandfather announced he was stepping down from the family company. Magnus Carrington had always been a quiet force in our lives, the kind of man whose presence didn't need words. But that day, the conference room smelled of polished wood and fresh paper, and the news hit me like frost on skin. My parents, Elise and Rowan Caro, beamed with satisfaction, already envisioning how they would divide influence and assets. My older sister, Selena, sat at the head of the table, glowing with anticipation. And me, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon, so you never miss a moment like this. Your like and share can carry this story to someone who needs hope, healing, or strength today. Red Heart. I was invisible. As Magnus began his speech, I realized the cruel patterns of my childhood hadn't gone away. He spoke about growth, innovation, and the future of Carrington and Sons. My parents whispered behind their hands, laughing at private jokes. Every time he glanced at me, it felt as if the gesture was polite but perfunctory. I was there, physically, but in the narrative of the room, I didn't exist. "Selena," Magnus said, "your role in managing the company shares will be formalized next week." He placed a folder in front of her. She opened it eagerly. My parents nodded approvingly, exchanging looks that said nothing about me, but everything about how they assumed I would follow silently. And then he handed me a small envelope, thin and light. I felt its weight in my hand and recognized the message before I even opened it. A scholarship fund. My grandfather had intended it to support my education, but the amount was absurdly symbolic. Enough to remind me I was supposed to be grateful, but too small to matter. My father glanced at me, smirking. "Go make your own way, Mara. That's what you'll have to do." My mother added, with her habitual air of satisfaction, "Some children just don't carry the ambition our family values." Her voice was calm, almost proud, as if she had delivered a verdict rather than an opinion. Selena didn't look at me, nodding politely. No one spoke, except for the distant hum of the air conditioning and the faint scratch of Magnus' pen on the podium. I stayed silent, hands resting on the envelope, letting the words and gestures imprint themselves on memory. I used to think silence was a passive state, something that only filled empty rooms. But I learned that silence can sit beside you even at a crowded table, weighing heavier than any voice. It could observe, calculate, and remember. That evening, I wandered through the family estate, the weight of their dismissal pressing down. My grandfather's study was quiet, the scent of old leather and cedar filling the air. He didn't notice me at first, busy with ledgers and reports, but then he handed me a small notebook, one of the many he'd kept over the years. "Watch closely, Mara," he said, eyes soft but sharp. "Not everything worth noticing is loud. Some truths live quietly." I nodded, running my fingers over the cover. He didn't lecture me about ambition or success. He didn't scold me for being overlooked. He only gave me tools to observe patterns and recognize manipulation, lessons my parents had failed to teach me. Weeks passed, and the true extent of my parents' intentions became clear. The scholarship fund wasn't the only thing they manipulated. They had quietly shifted shares and influence under my name, enrolling my identity in programs I never applied for, redirecting dividends, and siphoning educational stipends. They were stealing opportunity in plain sight. I discovered the first clue by chance. A notice from a professional program arrived in the mail, addressed to me. I hadn't signed up, hadn't authorized it. The enrollment had been funded with the scholarship money my grandfather had given me. My parents had forged documents claiming I wanted the programs. Every signature, every payment, every confirmation was a thread in a web they believed I'd never untangle. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask questions aloud. I took the documents, quietly tucked them into my notebook, and began to study the patterns. Their audacity was stunning, but so was the predictability. They had done it for years under the assumption that I was too small, too naive, too powerless to notice. But now I noticed everything. Every evening, I returned to my grandfather's study. I cross-referenced dates, payments, and enrollments, filling the notebook page after page. I wasn't angry yet. I was attentive, patient, watching. Silence became my method of preparation, my shield, and my weapon. Magnus left subtle notes, encoded references to investments and ledgers, teaching me to read between the lines. The scholarship fund, the shares, even the fake enrollments, they were all puzzles meant to test observation, and I intended to solve them. By the time my parents celebrated Selena's official control over the company shares, I had a clear understanding of the full scheme. They hadn't just ignored me, they had exploited my identity, siphoned my opportunities, and tested the limits of my invisibility. I remember sitting in the study late one night, the envelope from Magnus still unopened, my notebook sprawled across the desk. The air smelled faintly of cedar and ink calm, timeless. I wrote down the first calculations, aligning dates and funds. Each pattern revealed another act of manipulation, a breadcrumb trail left behind. I whispered to myself, almost without realizing it, "You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought silence meant submission, but I see everything, and I will not forget." It wasn't a vow of revenge yet. It was a vow of patience. I would let the evidence grow, let the web of exploitation become undeniable. And when the time came, the quiet observer would finally step into the light, and no one would underestimate me again. After the retirement announcement, the house felt smaller, sharper. Every conversation, every casual instruction from my parents seemed like another test of my awareness. I noticed patterns they thought no one could trace, accounts being redirected, programs I never enrolled in, invoices misfiled, checks signed under my name. It wasn't just the scholarship money. Over the months, I discovered that Elise and Rowan had been systematically reallocating dividends from my grandfather's company shares, claiming them as their own or diverting them to Selena. The evidence was buried under layers of paperwork, embedded in corporate filings and private ledgers, but the fingerprints were unmistakable. Every transaction carried their authorization codes, their signatures, their voice on recorded calls. I managed to obtain legally through old business communications. I spent evenings in the study poring over ledgers Magnus had left me. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, marked inconsistencies he had noticed but never publicly challenged. I aligned dates, checked amounts, compared signatures. A pattern emerged. Certain funds were always slightly under thresholds that required formal auditing, always routed through shell accounts, and always benefiting my parents or Selena while leaving me with nothing but the appearance of participation. Each discovery was a quiet sting. The betrayal wasn't abstract. It was measurable, precise, and systematic. Elise and Rowan weren't just careless or inattentive. They were methodical. They had assumed I was too young, too meek, too distracted to notice. But I noticed. Every misaligned payment, every forged document, every enrollment under my name became a thread in the web they had woven. I didn't confront them immediately. That would have been weakness. Instead, I documented everything. I scanned emails, saved digital copies of enrollment confirmations, printed bank statements, and cross-referenced each detail with public corporate filings. Night after night, I built a timeline, a map of deception that stretched across years. One evening, while comparing files, I noticed something remarkable. A series of payments from the scholarship fund coincided with Selena's trips abroad. Every expense had been justified under vague headings like educational support or administrative fees, but my careful cross-referencing showed that the dates and locations matched luxury hotels, international conferences, and private lessons my parents had promised only for me. I leaned back in the chair, heart steady, eyes cold with realization. They had stolen opportunities meant for me and converted them into luxury for themselves. They had created the illusion of care while enriching themselves and marginalizing me. It was infuriating, but I wasn't angry yet. I was methodical. I was patient. Patience was my weapon. Magnus had left more than just a notebook. In the back of the study, he had installed a small, discreet archive of recordings and correspondence. It wasn't meant to be a trap. It was meant to be a resource for someone who could understand the truth. And I did. Slowly, I realized I could piece together audio recordings from old company meetings, capturing my parents' instructions to misappropriate funds, redirect payments, and forge documents. Every word, once murky and untraceable, became clear when placed in context with the documents I had collected. I began assembling evidence meticulously, stacking digital files, scanned ledgers, and recordings into a secure cloud folder. The process was slow, precise. I didn't allow emotion to cloud judgment. Every detail mattered. The exact amount of misallocated funds, the date of a forged signature, the email confirming enrollment I never requested. Each anomaly was a nail in the structure of their deception. Then came the hardest part, tracking Selena's complicity. My sister had always been the favorite, the one who received every overt reward and acknowledgement. But beneath her polished veneer, she had followed instructions, knowingly accepting payments and opportunities that belonged to me. Each transaction traced back to her confirmed that she had been part of the scheme. It was painful to realize she had been both victim and accomplice, but I cataloged it all nonetheless. Weeks passed. By the time the company held its quarterly meeting, I had a full dossier, spreadsheets with calculations, annotated documents with highlights, recordings cross-referenced with dates, and a timeline of misappropriation. I could see the full scope now. The exploitation wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. I called in an ally, someone outside the family, who could verify the evidence. Her name was Veda, a financial analyst with a reputation for uncovering complex fraud schemes. I didn't explain everything to her at once. I handed her the organized folder and simply said, trace every payment, compare it to company filings, validate signatures, tell me if it all lines up. Veda was precise. In days, she returned confirmation. Every irregularity, every misappropriation, every instance of forgery was verified. The system my parents had relied upon to maintain plausible deniability was fully exposed. It was the moment I realized I held the truth in my hands, not as a weapon of anger, but as a shield and tool of inevitability. I didn't need dramatic confrontation, yet the evidence alone would speak louder than any argument. One night, I revisited Magnus' instructions in the letter I had found at the lake house. He had written, "Observe, understand, and act when the time is right. The world can't dispute what it can't ignore." I traced each signature again, verifying every detail, reinforcing the connections. Each annotation, each cross-reference, made the eventual confrontation inevitable. They had underestimated me, thinking my quiet nature meant weakness. But quiet had been my strategy, patience my preparation, and observation my weapon. By the time I was ready to move forward, I knew every angle. I had a plan, not of impulsive vengeance, but of strategic exposure. The confrontation would take place where it mattered, in front of impartial witnesses, supported by undeniable evidence, leaving no room for manipulation. No lies could survive this. The hardest realization, though, was personal. I had to accept that Selena had been complicit, that betrayal, layered over decades, wasn't just my parents' doing. But I didn't let it fracture my purpose. I cataloged her actions, noting every detail, knowing the evidence would speak for itself. I didn't need to make her the enemy. I only needed the truth recognized. As the days grew shorter and autumn deepened, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. My notebook, my cloud folder, the recordings, they were all ready. The stage was set, and I was prepared to claim control of my own story. The first step was always preparation. I had observed, verified, cataloged, and confirmed. And now, as I sat in Magnus' study one last time before the confrontation, I understood silence is not weakness. Patience is not submission. Truth, when properly assembled, is unstoppable. The day of confrontation arrived like any ordinary morning, but I knew nothing about this would be ordinary. Magnus' study, where I had spent weeks assembling the evidence, now felt like the nerve center of justice. I carried the cloud folder on a secure tablet, my notebook, and a small set of printed documents. Every page, every digital copy, every recording had been verified by Veda. There was no room for debate. I requested a private review meeting with a neutral arbitrator, someone experienced in corporate disputes. The room was sterile, neutral, and professional. Exactly what I wanted. My parents, Elise and Rowan, entered with Selena beside them, confident smiles masking the subtle tension I knew they felt. They had no idea that the quiet child they had dismissed was now the architect of the truth they could no longer deny. "Shall we begin?" I asked, voice calm but carrying an unshakable authority. My hands rested on the folder. I could feel the weight of every hidden transaction, every forged signature, every diverted payment. Elise smirked slightly. "I suppose we can," she said. The words almost casual, but her eyes flickered with uncertainty. I opened the first folder and projected the initial timeline. "Let's start with the scholarship fund," I said. Dates, amounts, and enrollments appeared clearly on the screen. All of these enrollments were submitted without my knowledge or consent. Every payment was rerouted to programs and expenses you claimed I requested. Rowan's hand twitched, and Selena's eyes widened slightly. My voice remained even measured. "And here are the confirmations, emails, and records proving signatures were forged. Every action can be traced to either of you." I let a beat of silence hang in the room, letting the evidence speak. Elisa's smug composure faltered. Rowan cleared his throat, but the words caught somewhere between indignation and disbelief. I continued, moving systematically. The company shares my grandfather had left under my name, all diverted, all manipulated. Spreadsheets showed every irregular dividend, every account misappropriation. The visual clarity left nothing ambiguous. "This is not interpretation," I said quietly. "These are documented facts." Veda, sitting beside me, nodded slightly. She was ready to provide professional testimony if necessary. I didn't need to raise my voice. My calm, methodical presentation was a force no one could interrupt. Then I played a set of recordings, my parents' own voices, unaware they were captured legally in past corporate meetings, discussing how to redirect funds and exploit my identity. Every word, every instruction was crystal clear. Elisa's hand tightened over the armrest. Rowan's jaw clenched. They could not argue with the evidence because it wasn't opinion, it was fact. Finally, I turned to Selena. "Your involvement has been documented as well," I said softly, holding her gaze. "Every transaction you authorized, every acceptance of misappropriated funds, has been verified. This isn't personal judgment, it's accountability." The room went quiet. I didn't need to say more. Silence was the ultimate amplifier for truth. The arbitrator, reviewing the documents, nodded, confirming the meticulous organization of every detail. My parents, who had relied on manipulation and plausible deniability, realized too late that their decades of planning had crumbled. I stood slowly, placing the tablet and notebook on the table. "You assumed my silence meant weakness," I said. "You assumed my patience was ignorance. You were wrong. Every act of deceit, every attempt to erase me has been traced, documented, and is now undeniable." Rowan opened his mouth, probably to protest, to attempt another lie. I didn't flinch. Elisa's lips pressed into a tight line. Selena looked down at her hands, silent. The arbitrator finally spoke. "MS, Mara Carrington, based on the evidence, the scholarship fund must be restored, and all company shares and dividends misappropriated in your name are to be returned or redirected appropriately. Further legal review is authorized for potential forgery and fraud." I nodded once, letting the words settle. Justice wasn't about dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. It was about truth, inevitability, and the careful orchestration of accountability. My parents' attempts at manipulation had failed because I had built a system stronger than their deceit. After the formal process, I left the office, the crisp autumn air brushing against my skin. For decades, I had carried their dismissals, their mockery, their calculated erasure of my worth. Today, I carried only clarity. The world could no longer question my rights, my identity, or the value of my life. Later, in the quiet of Magnus' study, I reflected on what had happened. I didn't feel triumphant in a vengeful sense. I felt a rare, quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction wasn't in punishment, it was in balance. The truth had been recognized, and my voice, long ignored, was finally heard. I pulled the small envelope Magnus had given me months earlier from my pocket. Inside were final instructions and personal notes. He had always believed that the quiet observer would see the truth where others could not. He had trusted me to act when the time was right. Now I had. I placed the envelope on the desk and let my fingers brush over the worn wood. The air smelled faintly of cedar and ink, unchanged despite everything. I realized then that survival had been the first step, but action had been the final step. I had reclaimed not only what was mine, but the authority over my own life and narrative. In the following weeks, I restored the scholarship funds, ensured company shares were returned to my name, and formalized control of the portions of the family business my grandfather had intended for me. Selena, realizing the extent of the evidence against her, cooperated quietly. My parents avoided confrontation entirely, their usual bravado replaced with cautious distance. I created a small foundation in Magnus' honor, using part of my restored funds to help young people whose opportunities were at risk due to neglect or exploitation. Every scholarship I funded, every mentorship I offered, was a quiet reminder of what I had survived and what I had learned. Attention, patience, and integrity were far more powerful than any inheritance misused by the unworthy. I often returned to the office window, looking at the city skyline. The world was vast, and the past had been heavy. But now, the air felt lighter, the path ahead clear. I had learned that betrayal could be endured, but truth, once uncovered and wielded carefully, was unstoppable. The moral of my story isn't a flourish or a warning. It's a quiet affirmation. Silence doesn't equal submission. Patience isn't weakness. Observation, preparation, and integrity give you control over the life others try to steal. And sometimes the quietest victory is the one that shapes not only your destiny, but also the world around you. I tucked the last documents into the study cabinet, the envelope inside, Magnus' instructions preserved. I stepped outside, the cool wind brushing my face. For the first time in my life, the world felt steady, the past behind me, and the future fully mine. I breathed deeply, letting the weight of 30 years lift. No dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation, only clarity, patience, and truth, the quiet power that no one could take from me.